So we've got that envious position of about 35 minutes after the lunch break. I'm sure everybody's just at the height of their peak of mental faculties right now, so we're going to dive into the most titillating topic of the day, nuclear, of course. And just as a stage setter, since I know you're all about my generation, what happened in April of 1977? Momentous day for nuclear power in the United States, right? Yeah, I see a lot of eyes glazing over out there. President Jimmy Carter, April of 1977, a Navy Academy nuclear-trained engineer, signs a presidential executive order banning the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel in the United States. About 12 months later, the following spring, blockbuster Hollywood movie, The China Syndrome, and about 12 months after that, in March of 1979, 3 Mile Island. Arguably, that could have been the beginning of the demise of the nuclear renaissance that was happening in the United States the previous 25 years. So, nuclear renaissance. I'm old enough, I've heard that phrase now about every 15 years for the last 50 years. And now I'm hearing it again, nuclear renaissance. Is it real this time? Should it be real this time? Can it be real this time? So we've got an excellent panel up here. Dave, Doug, Clay, we're going to dive right in. I'm going to get each of yours perspective on this. That's the general theme. Is it real this time? But let's go one at a time. I'm going to ask you a few specific questions, starting with what's holding us up? What, if any, one regulatory policy, one economic environment, one technical challenge is there that's keeping you from going forward at this point? Or if you were, President Carter for the day or President Trump for the day and could sign an executive order, what one thing could get us going, get us over the hump?
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me. To Constellation, we're the largest nuclear owner-operator in the United States. We own about a quarter of the active nuclear reactors in the U.S., and we've been evaluating opportunities for new nuclear for quite some time. And you asked, can it be, should it be, will it be? Absolutely, yes, it can be. Yes, it should be. Will it be? I think is still a bit of an open question. If you're asking, me, I think for sure it's happening, but it's not a foregone conclusion. What's the biggest challenge? Well, the lesson we learned from the Vogtle units is that there is a pretty big hurdle to get over in terms of being on time and on budget, and who owns that risk. And if that could be solved, we would have a bunch of nuclear built today, because there are people who are willing to sign up for contracts long-term at the right prices for operating an active nuclear unit. The question is, how do you go from point A to point B to get that unit online, and who's going to wear that risk, and how are you going to share it? And if we can get a combination of the private sector, the government, and big customers figuring that out, the nuclear renaissance will happen.
Well, while we're on that point, Vogtle 3 and 4, pair of AP Westinghouse 1000s, beautiful reactors. I think as far as learning curve, getting the logistics and supply chain going, the right time to build the next two AP 1000s would have been about halfway through the construction of those. We're now a year, at least 2 years beyond the completion and commissioning of both of those. Are we too far back down into the trough of the learning curve where we're going to have to resurrect it all again?
Yeah, I don't know about resurrecting it all again from whole cloth, but certainly the more time that passes, you're absolutely right. Some of those learnings go away. The workforce, the supply chain, all of the above. That's all. It's unfortunate, but anyone who's looking to invest, put capital at risk, their shareholder capital at risk in the situation with Constellation. Our CEO 3 or 4 years ago said, have my head inspected if I start talking about new nuclear. Today, he's leaning in because he does see a path, does see an avenue, but we have to still solve the problem I started with, which is who's going to wear the risk of cost overruns.
Okay. Doug, your perspective?
There's not so we're deploying a small modular reactor technology, molten salt. It was demonstrated in the 60s. There's not a technological challenge. There's not a regulatory challenge. You won't hear that often. We got our permit in September of last year. We started the project in 2020. University of Texas, A&M, Georgia Tech, Abilene Christian all we're a university research, how do we get a permit as quickly as possible? And so we got the permit from the NRC in September, and my comment at Oak Ridge last year was the NRC did exactly what they said they would do in less time than they said they would do it. We have done this before, past is prologue. 20 years ago with the fracking revolution, my company, EXL Petroleum, so I'm not a nuclear guy, I'm an oil and gas guy.
You're a nuclear guy now.
I am now, I'm becoming one. We demonstrated new technology with hydraulic fracturing. And we had to demonstrate that. Basically what we were able to do is tap the source rock and then go to the community and say, we don't drill dry holes anymore. That's what happened. It took a while for that to sink in. When that sank in, Quantum Energy Partners was one of our private equity partners. $90 billion was placing in the Permian to get in on that play. When that level of capital hits the market, then things, steel mills in the Northeast open, sand mines in Wisconsin open, the only new rail being laid in the country was being laid in the Permian. Regulatory reform happened. The Railroad Commission, I saw Chairwoman Craddock here earlier, went from 8 weeks to issue a drilling permit to 3 days because we brought a new technology, a new way of doing things, and the regulator adapted. I think that's what we see happening. But the challenge we have is where we did with the hydraulic fracturing, you have to demonstrate it. We've got to deploy. And once we deploy, we're in the process of signing EPC agreements on our first reactor. But until you do that, the financial community particularly is going to sit back and say, we're still not convinced until we actually see one. That's the challenge.
Clay, your perspective?
I think it's been well said. You mentioned, Fred, in the opening about this term nuclear renaissance, and it does get used about every 15 years. And since the big build out of the nuclear fleet in the late 70s and early 80s, we have largely gotten out of the business. The supply chain has atrophied, the skills and crafts have moved on to other things, and yet we've still tried to get back into nuclear about every 10 or 15 years and had some horrific experiences. And the big shadow of Vogtle still overshadows the industry today. And I can guarantee you Joe Dominguez thinks about it, and every potential deployer of capital who is asking to put capital at risk to build a new nuclear plant has the biggest question on their mind is, can this plant be deployed on time, on budget? One thing you know about nuclear, if the plant gets deployed over the life of that project at some point, hopefully soon, but in any case later, it will be an economic and wonderful asset. Yeah. We know that. The question is, can it be completed, and can it be completed at a reasonable cost? That is the problem that we set out to address at X-Energy from day one. We are a developer of a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor using a pebble fuel form that is intrinsically safe. It is meltdown-proof. And when you start with a reactor that is meltdown-proof, it is simpler, more elegant, has fewer moving parts, fewer subsystems and components. It is an easier machine to build, and therefore we believe we've dramatically reduced the construction execution risk, which is the thing that's held our industry back for 30 years. Now, I've got to prove that, and when we prove that, the nuclear renaissance will be at its fullest flowering.
Okay. Well, let me ask a slightly different question. This one might not quite apply to you as much, Clay, as the others. Back to Jimmy Carter in 1977. Do we need to be able to reprocess spent nuclear fuel, whether for large boiling water reactors or SMRs or advanced SMRs? There's a little bit of nuance there. But again, that executive order was rescinded 4 years later when Reagan took office, obviously. But that put a regulatory fear, I think, in a lot of people's hearts, that if you're going to invest billions of dollars on 10, 20, 30, 40-year projects, but the next president who comes along can sign an executive order and kill your investment, I mean, I think that's the definition of regulatory uncertainty, unless Congress were to do something to act like pass a law saying it is legal and forevermore shall be legal to reprocess fuel in the United States. Would that affect Constellation very much?
Well, we're sitting on ton of fuel that could be reprocessed, and it
Yeah.
would be a great thing economically for us. But
Well, you're sitting on it, but it's the government's responsibility, right?
well, that's a whole another conversation for a different panel, probably. I'm not going to get into that morass of law and policy. But yeah, obviously it would be great for us when we think it could be safely done. But do I think it's a precondition to the nuclear renaissance? I don't. I do think that onshoring enrichment capability or getting into some other friendly places around the world is going to be critically important. There's some policymakers in Washington who you know, have a certain position on where can enriched fuel come from, and you know, today, you know, the aspirations of the policymakers don't match the supply chain. And so if Washington wants to see that outcome, we're going to need some help there, or, you know, one way or another, whether it's a delay in some of these bans on certain countries or ultimately helping to, you know, jumpstart that part of the economy. But on enriched fuel itself, like, we're not seeing that as like the linchpin to the nuclear renaissance.
Go ahead, Clay.
Fred, in a previous life, I used to do energy policy at the White House in the Energy Department, and I've been part of the reprocessing discussions forever. What you didn't say is that Reagan repealed the ban on reprocessing 40 years ago. How much commercial reprocessing do we have? Zero. Why? It's not because we don't have an abundance of spent fuel, it's because of economics. There is a huge amount of uranium that can be relatively cheaply enriched within the Earth's crust. And until the price of that makes reprocessing economic, that energy that resides in spent fuel is going to remain there. Now, all of the spent fuel in the United States, all of it, wouldn't fill up a Costco. Yes, it has a radiological signature, which is significant and has to be managed, but you know, quantitatively, it's not that much material. And so disposing of that fuel is not a scientific challenge, it's not an engineering challenge, it is a political challenge, but it's one that's owned 100% by the US government.
Right.
And so it is, whether we reprocess or not, is interesting. I'm personally a fan of it if the economics work, but it has zero impact on the nuclear renaissance or whether it happens.
Well, and in particular with your fuel source and your approach.
Yeah, I mean, we use enriched uranium in ours, and so.
And we know where every one of those grains of spent fuel resides in this country from the very beginning of the civil nuclear economy in this country, which is, I mean, amazing.
Show me an industry, any industry represented in this room, that can tell you where every bit of waste you've ever produced is, how much it is, where it is, and what it's done to the public and the environment.
Yeah.
No one has the waste record that the nuclear industry has. I say that unapologetically.
Doug, you want to pile on that?
Molten salt reactors. So we're molten salt cooled liquid fueled reactor. We're a bit like a trash can. We can burn anything. We're using HALEU. The HALEU, we were admitted to the DOE pilot program a month ago. We received a fuel allocation last week from the Department of Energy. The fuel we are utilizing for our reactor is spent nuclear fuel. It's the fuel left over from the experimental breeder reactor program that's sitting in INL. So we don't reprocess. I think the word I like is reutilize. We have the capacity, molten salt reactor, liquid fueled reactors, to take current stockpiles of spent nuclear fuel, cut it up, clean it up, and drop it as fuel into our reactors. So our argument from a molten, I agree, I don't think the renaissance is dependent upon that happening, but we have limited supplies of uranium, particularly as we look at the world supply chain and China's Belt and Road Initiative. Our reactors can use thorium. Thorium has never been utilized in the US, so we didn't go down that pathway for our first reactor. But our argument is there's tremendous amounts, 95% of the fuel is still in the fuel rod. There's tremendous amounts of fuel sitting in those fuel rods, perfectly usable. Don't throw it away, don't dispose of it. Let's put it in reactors and turn it into power.
Okay, let's just take one more spin on that, particularly with you, Dave. Constellation, I don't want to necessarily you own a lot of that spent fuel, but you're in possession of a lot of that spent fuel at your facilities. Why is that more viewed as an asset. It is, it's fuel. I mean, 90% of the energy is still in there if we're to reprocess. I mean, when's that going to turn into an asset on your ledger sheet versus a
Well, I
liability?
mean, Clay said it so well about, what's the most economic, alternative to, or the most economic option for nuclear fuel, whether it's for, the existing fleet or, more AP1000s, or whether it's for advanced nuclear. It's the enrichment of uranium coming out of the ground today versus trying to, create an industry of reprocessing what's, in spent nuclear fuel today. So it's really an economic question. And I'm not going to repeat everything Clay said, but until the economics turn the other way around, people aren't going to put, capital into that effort.
Okay. Well, let's say I believe you all three. Hook, line, and sinker. I'm a little bit biased. We're in the midst of a nuclear renaissance. It's going to be real this time. Where's it going to happen and why? And Dave, I'll let you go first. I mean, where do you see the real opportunity?
Well, I mean, talk about being biased. It's going to happen at our sites. It has to happen at our sites. Think about that. Where is the best place to put new nuclear? It is at existing nuclear. Why is that the case? Well, we have all the infrastructure. We have access to water. We have access to transmission. We have communities that support nuclear completely, full-heartedly. It is just not a question. And frankly, the load that's going to be located next to the existing nuclear is going to support new nuclear as well. So just the synergies of doing it there is what makes the most sense. And ultimately, the customers are going to drive that answer. But I believe the customers are going to want to continue to contract with existing nuclear. We just announced 2 big deals in the last couple of years, the reopening of the Crane Clean Energy Center at the TMI site, as well as a big transaction with the Clinton facility, fully subscribing the Clinton facility for 20 years. It's going to allow it to relicense. It's going to allow us to look at new nuclear. It's going to allow us to do all the upgrades. So whether it's upgrades, whether it's SMRs, or whether it's AP1000s, those are all going to be located, we think, first at our sites.
Doug?
I think it's inevitable. Yeah, that's 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, was appointed by Governor Rick Perry to the Texas Energy Planning Council, and I chaired the Energy Supply Committee. We were launching the hydraulic fracturing revolution, but the wind industry was making early claims. They showed up at all our hearings and said, we're going to replace oil and gas. And so I issued a finding to the governor's office that if, hypothetical, I hold everyone here, there wasn't a climate agenda in 2004. If we are going to replace hydrocarbons for power, particularly base load, and primarily coal was the workhorse, right? 70% of the grid came from coal. The only technology that can replace that is nuclear. That was 2004. Now, we went on with the hydraulic fracturing revolution. We hit peak nuclear power production, coal production, in this country around 2010. When you pull coal off the grid, then I go back to what I said in 2004, nuclear became inevitable. To meet the power needs, whether it's AP1000s or SMRs or whatever the case may be, you have to have that dispatchable power. Governor Abbott created, which my second gubernatorial appointment, was Advanced Nuclear Working Group. 2 mandates: reinforce the grid with advanced nuclear, capture this industry for Texas, the advanced nuclear industry. 2023, the Texas legislature, and that resulted in $350 million going under Chairman Harris's House Bill 14 into the Texas nuclear bill. 2023, the Texas legislature created the Texas Energy Fund, $5 billion aimed at natural gas generation, but still we have to bring more power onto the grid. And that was mostly before the rise of AI and data centers. Yeah. If you come to Abilene, Texas, you'll see our advanced reactor facility. You also see, and I think Lancium was on stage earlier, you'll see the first deployment of Stargate in Abilene. It's phenomenal. 1.2 gigawatt of power, and probably one of many. So when coal did that, in my mind, nuclear, as we said in 2004, became inevitable.
Well, that's a good point, and perhaps a synergy. We've decommissioned a lot of coal power plants in the United States and in Texas the last 10, 15 years. Are those good locations, brownfield coal power plant sites, to site nuclear?
We're losing,
the transmission, you've
last
got the
number
water.
I saw was 12 to 14 gigawatt of power coming off the grid. As the grid in Texas is going from, this is from the hearings that we conducted on the governors, going from 90 gigawatts to, at one point I heard 225 gigawatts in Texas in the next 6 years, or whatever the current ERCOT prediction is. San Antonio has kept what they call the dirty old man, because they have to have the power from that coal plant. We met with Colorado a few days ago. They're pulling 3 massive coal plants off the grid with, as far as I can tell, no real plan on how they're going to replace that power. But it's a perfect, the infrastructure's there, some of the regulations, you have to deal with some indemnification issues, but it makes sense. Coal to nuclear, natural gas to nuclear, all makes sense.
Clay, where do you see the opportunity?
I'll tell you where it's going to happen. And
Can I write this down?
with the greatest respect to David, who will be a fast follower, no doubt. But the first place it's going to happen is in Texas, as it should be. And it's going to, we are developing.
We own nuclear in Texas.
Yeah,
So you put it there.
I'm talking about new plants. I'm talking about new plants, David. The first new plant, the first new reactor that's going to go critical is probably Doug's prototype reactor. The first new commercial plant in Texas is going to be an XC100 that Dow Chemical is developing as a combined steam and power plant behind the meter at their Seadrift, Texas ethylene plant in Calhoun County. We have fabulous community support down there. We have a tremendous working relationship with Dow. We see, quite frankly, an incredible opportunity that could be replicated all along the Gulf Coast of using nuclear-generated steam to help decarbonize and sustain. Just as Darren Wood said this morning, like, more energy, less emissions. If you want to talk more energy and less emissions, one of the best ways to reduce emissions from the petrochemical sector is to use nuclear-generated steam. So that's what we're going to demonstrate on a commercial basis at Dow. That plant will come online in the early 2030s. That will be one of the first, if not the first, commercial SMR to come online in the United States. Then we intend to fill up, park as many as we can next to David's existing nuclear reactors.
Well, you make a good point there, the synergy between industrial power and nuclear. Now, I mean, you take what's effectively a 30% efficient steam plant, which is all a nuclear plant is. If you can use that waste process heat in industrial processes like Dow is doing, that really opens the doors. And it also shows people who can sit down and do a spreadsheet at the big industrial level and see, hey, this makes economic sense to put this at my site. It makes a lot of sense. Why aren't the oil and gas people doing this at refineries? You'd think that would almost be a very similar situation synergistically to produce their own power and be able to take off all that heat process heat.
They will. They will.
I mean, if oil and gas wants to actually say, we're going clean, we're going green, go nuclear.
And honestly, look, I have great love for the oil and gas sector. Like, no sector has done more to lift the human condition than the oil and gas sector, from fertilizer to transportation and everything else. They also happen to be the very best in the world in managing large, complex, multi-billion-dollar constructions.
Yep.
That is a sector that would be welcomed into the nuclear field. I think there's tremendous expertise that can be deployed. Quite frankly, as the nuclear supply chain in the United States gets rebuilt, it ought to be rebuilt on the Texas Gulf Coast, centered around all of that existing capability. So I think there's a huge upside, and other companies that look like Dow, that have industrial needs for steam, we're heavily engaged with, and we'll be announcing those when they're ready.
Glad to hear that. I was going to segue into the Texas theme, but you gentlemen did it for me. So Dave, STP, Comanche Peak. We've got 2 fantastic nuclear power plants existing here in Texas, been operating for decades. In fact, STP was looking at expansion in 2010, and then that nasty little thing called Fukushima came along, kind of put that dashed hopes. What is keeping us as Texas from doubling down on both those sites and planting a couple more AP1000s or even SMRs?
Yeah, I don't think there's unique challenges for Texas on the nuclear renaissance front. It's all the things we started with from our perspective. We'd love to look at expanding STP and adding a 3rd reactor there. Like like I've already said, those are the best places where there's existing nuclear. So I think if we solve the challenges for the industry in general, and we solve the on time and on budget, how to allocate that risk, it's going to happen. I agree with Clay. It's going to happen in Texas. It's going to happen everywhere where load's growing. And if you even believe half the projections, and we maybe believe half the projections, I don't know how you get 100 gigawatts of data centers on in Texas if it costs $35 billion for a 1 gigawatt data center, and there's $300 billion annual of all the hyperscalers combined capital budget. That's an old number. Maybe it's 400. You still can't come close to those numbers. But it's wherever there's going to be load growth, there's going to be opportunity for nuclear. And if we can just get past this not insignificant hurdle of the first of a kind risk, and we get to nth of a kind, I think we estimate you probably need 5, 6, 7, 8. That's kind of the magic number where you start seeing some real reductions in price and risk. This thing's going to take off like a rocket.
Okay. Doug, you're an old oil and gas guy.
I am.
The Permian.
Old oil and gas guy.
Permian's going electric. Permian's been electrifying for almost a decade now.
Right.
How about some SMRs out in the oil patch?
So actually, one of our announced projects is not addressing electricity but water. I helped create the problem 20 years ago when we started hydraulic fracturing. So the produced water issue is a huge water issue in Texas. The Permian is the Achilles heel of Texas. If the Permian were to shut down or curtail, it would be massive economic influence across the state. We have to solve the produced water problem. We're running out of pore space. We're having seismic events. So we've already announced a partnership with the Texas Produced Water Consortium to deploy a gigawatt of power is I think where we're headed to desal produced water and also provide operating power to the Permian. That on top of the $350 million that went into the Texas Nuclear Fund, the other support of nuclear was a $120 million direct appropriation that went to the partnership of Texas Tech University, which is where the Texas Produced Water Consortium is housed. That came out of legislation, I think, in 2021. And then Abilene Christian and Natura, and that's a $120 million appropriation aimed specifically at getting our first, as Clay mentioned, our demonstration reactor online so we can deploy reactors in the Permian desalinating water. And the reason it's important there is the produced water has 3 to 10 times the level of salinity that either formation or coastal waters have. And so RO filters won't work. You need heat, thermal heat. We operate over 600 degrees C, and so it's a thermal process. So that's, when I started Natura in 2020, came out of retirement from the oil and gas industry, the very first scenario that I threw out was desalinating produced water in the Permian. So it's a water issue. We handle both water and power. So worked closely with Senator Perry on the $10 billion Texas water plan.
Excellent. Clay, your perspective?
I'd like to talk about something else.
Go right ahead.
The key, what I'm deadly focused on is the issue that will make David move, which is reducing the execution risk. And so the key in this is to get a reactor to kind of nth of a kind from a risk and cost standpoint. Does anyone in the room know the last time we built an nth of a kind reactor in the United States?
I think the Navy's been doing it for decades.
Who has?
The Navy.
It's different. The
Okay.
Navy has an unlimited amount of money. One of the worst examples you can use is the Navy. Because, if you want to linger on the bottom of the Atlantic and hold your enemies at risk, you'll pay a lot for that power. It is not a commercial, replicable example. I love the Navy, but it's way too expensive. The last time we had an nth of a kind plant built in the United States was never.
Never.
And so we've got to do that. We have to make, as an industry, we have to make nuclear boring. And the way we're doing that at X Energy is with our simplified design.
Right.
And then we made a deal with Amazon last year. Amazon, at their $2.5 trillion market cap, is bigger than the entirety of the investor-owned utilities sector in North America.
Yeah.
One entity. They bought 20% of our company, and they agreed to they announced a target buy of 5 gigawatts, which is only 64 of our XC100 reactors, but more than enough to get us to an nth of a kind. We're going to deploy those at a gigawatt a site, maybe 2 gigawatts on one site, so we're talking 3 to 4 sites over a 14-year period where we're building tens and tens of these units. We'll get to an nth of a kind somewhere between the 20th and 30th one that we build. And that will allow an EPC to come wrap the construction. It will allow infrastructure capital and traditional project finance to come build these. All David will have to do is, offtake the agreement, or he'll build it. He'll build it off an offtake agreement from Amazon. That is where we want to go. And when we make nuclear boring, when we make it just another piece of energy or steam generating equipment, then everything that Doug is talking about opens up. We now have an economic tool where we can change the face of the American West with a different water policy, because we can clean up brackish waters, we can clean up produced waters, we can use surface disposal opportunities to change, to re-wet the lakes and creeks in West Texas in a way that we haven't seen since before the 1950 drought. So, that's the opportunity in front of us. It will allow us to completely change the nature of the US economy and meet the power needs that will allow us to achieve all of our hopes and dreams from an AI standpoint, but we have to get there. We have to get to a point where private capital, without the assistance of the federal government, can build these plants as quickly as possible. That is what we're playing for. And that's the prize that we are intensely focused on at X Energy.
Okay, let me throw a black swan at Jill just to cap this off. We've got a couple minutes. I had a really sharp graduate student last year from Kazakhstan. He was doing his master's thesis on Kazakhstan and wants to build a nuclear power plant. Who should they team with? China, Russia, European countries like France or the United States. And it was a great piece of research. I mean, I told him the answer before he even started, and he knew the answer before he even started. The answer was China, 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 and China. China built them quickest. China's got the most advanced. China needs Kazakhstan's uranium. China had the supply chain. China had the proximity. China had the money. So, I mean, it was a foregone conclusion, and that is what he came up with. But it also brings to light, Kazakhstan is currently supplying more than a third of the world's uranium. If China starts to pull Kazakhstan into their political influential sphere, what does that do with uranium supply globally and the prices we were just talking about? That leaves us what, Australia, Canada? We're doing everything we can to make them happy with us these days. Or do we start digging up uranium in the United States again? Is that something that we could fumble badly, or perhaps are in the process of fumbling badly geopolitically, and would possibly kill our next chance of nuclear renaissance?
You're talking about the supply of uranium?
Yeah.
Well, going back to the
parking lot where all
conversation
the
we
spent
had earlier
fuel
about
is,
uranium, there's a lot of uranium sitting around waiting to be used. When I started funding a project at Abilene Christian. I thought I was retiring. I bought a bass boat that I haven't really got to use. What happened was Governor Perry became Secretary Perry, heard about the research, sent a team down, flew us to DC and said, you need to build a reactor. We have to capture this technology. We have to beat China. We have to beat Russia. And I held my hand up, and Dr. Schubert at ACU held his hand up and said, okay, we'll do this. That was the motivation for, okay, we're going to build a reactor, because the DOE said we need to. Now, when I've gone back to talk to the DOE or talk to groups, we're not beating China, we're not beating Russia. China has deployed a molten salt liquid fueled thorium reactor. So we're seeing them in advanced reactors. Russia, I think, is the world's largest propagator of nuclear reactors currently. So if we do view these technologies as critical, not just mentioning the supply chain, uranium and so forth, which is why thorium for us comes into the conversation. Okay. And then you're really talking to India in a big way. So you have to answer those questions, absolutely. We're
just about out of time. Dave, any last words?
No, I mean, I think I'm not going to speculate on what happens with Kazakhstan and China. I think we, despite the geopolitical dynamic between the major superpowers of this world, we've been able to manage nuclear fuel issues amongst ourselves pretty well, frankly, and I think that will continue. I think it's just there's too much of a a balance of power there to mess that up, but we'll see. But I know, like I said, appreciate being on the panel, and I think in 5 years it's going to be a very different conversation.
Clay, any last words? Last 16 seconds.
Well, to the students in the crowd, I want to say thank you for your interest in energy. I think the period that we're in now is one of the greatest periods in history to make a meaningful impact, to improve the condition in the world, to make money, to build new businesses. And so I graduated from UT Law School in 1992. So I want to inspire you. Your future, you lawyers in the crowd, you're not destined to slave away inside a big law firm. You can come build a great company and do something exciting.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.